We were working with IBM and Maersk on the blockchain, and they just pulled the plug 2 weeks ago, which was a complete shock to us.
That's the voice of Barry Bednar, CEO of SodaFlexx. SodaFlexx was established in 2018 to provide the marine industry an alternative to traditional wet scrubbers by using dry exhaust cleaning systems that are adapted from proven land-based technology. Not only do we talk about the technology of using powder for cleaning emissions, but also how his company was impacted by the closing of Tradelens, the Maersk IBM venture into blockchain. That's what you heard him talk about there. Thanks for listening to the podcast, and don't forget to follow. Now on to the show. Welcome, everyone. Are you listening to The Last Dinosaur? And I'm your host, Chris Aversano. On today's pod, we have Barry Bednar, CEO of SodaFlexx. Barry's been trading in the shipping industry since 1990, holding a variety of progressively senior roles in the trading side of maritime space. His most recent endeavor, SodaFlexx, is a dry powder exhaust gas cleaning system for the maritime industry. What is most interesting, already in use for shoreside applications, and now he's trying it on ships. Barry, welcome to the pod.
Hi, Chris. How you doing? Good. Thanks for having me.
So when we started talking about this, I appreciate you coming on. We started talking a little bit about SodaFlexx. Tell me what you're doing there, because it's a really interesting concept. And how did you get to this point?
Well, I don't mind if you humor me. I can give you just a quick little backstory. As you mentioned, I've been in the shipping industry for a lot longer than 1990, actually, but we don't want to give our ages away. But about 3 or 4 years ago, I started working with a group of ship owners to install wet scrubbers on ships. We saw the opportunity with IMO 2020 to advise people. There's a lot of questions around that. And we installed quite a few wet scrubbers, but I'm not really a technical person, more of the jack of all trades in shipping. And I saw several things that disturbed me. I saw with the initial ones that came out, there were a lot of engine room problems, even some fires, a lot of melting parts of the bits, and then the piping had to be all updated to fiberglass or something like that. So because it was the water that was being used for wet scrubbers was so caustic. But the thing that really struck me and kind of pushed me over the edge was when we had to start putting a 25 mil plate of steel on the outside of the vessel where the quote unquote safe wash water was being put overboard. So that stuff was so acidic, it was literally rotting out the holes of the ships. So I live in London, and I take a short train to work every morning, and I noticed that there was a power plant right outside of London Bridge Station. And I was curious, well, how can they clean their exhaust in the middle of a city? And we see a little smoke plume, but it didn't look nasty. And looked into it more and found that the power industry as a whole uses a powder-based system to clean the exhaust. Even more into it, and found that the powder that's most widely used or most acceptable is sodium bicarbonate, which is baking soda. It's the same stuff that you use in your toothpaste. You cook with it, fire extinguishers, everything like that. It's completely benign, safe, non-explosive, and readily available. So I started thinking about how we could maybe adapt that to ships. They're just small power plants or bigger power plants, if you look at VLCCs or something like that float. And I had a company that I've dealt with in the past. For my sins, I own some partial parts of some pneumatic cement carriers. And with that, we have the technology that we know how to move powder around in a marine environment. And so I asked the company that did that to provide a system that could dose sodium bicarbonate into a marine system. And they were able to come up with a few prototypes, and we went through a whole bunch of stuff. And right before COVID hit, we were about to install on several tankers, and then the bottom just fell out. So we spent the past year and a half keeping our powder dry, pun intended, I guess, developing and making the system better. So now, I guess I should digress a little bit. The way it works is that sodium bicarbonate is a powder in powder form, is injected into the exhaust gas stream, where in the chemical process above 80 degrees Celsius, the sodium bicarbonate acts like a popcorn, and it expands to 3 times its size and absorbs sulfur. So you have the sodium bicarbonate combining with the sulfur oxides, and they chemically change into sodium sulfate, which is a salt. pH 7, benign, no salt. It's not acidic or anything like that. And that is safely either we can emit it into the atmosphere, and then it just goes up and then dissolves into the ocean, or we have capture technology if people want to capture the particulate matter, we use cyclones for that, and then we can return that effluent back to the to land, and we put that into the cement industry as a substitute for cement. And the way that works is so it makes a circular process where we are replacing the CO2 nasty cement with this effluent or residue particles. So that's how this started, and we've now been able to put it on several ships. We've got it down to our consumption levels are fairly good. The beauty of our things, if you compare it to an exhaust, a wet scrubber, is that we don't have to go to dry dock. It's a completely dry system, so there's no acidic water being used. We do have an issue about, of course, of powder, because we have to deliver the powder to the ship. And that's one of my biggest challenges is running this company, is trying to set up the logistics globally of how to get stuff around. But as I mentioned, it is regular sodium bicarbonate. It's ground to a special formula for us. It is readily available, and it's easy to move in containers and stuff like that. There's quite a few people that make it, but we are partnered with a company called Solvay, which is the people who invented sodium bicarbonate process chemically back in the 1860s. So they have all the backing and all the way of producing the stuff around the world, and they were able to make this process work for us on the shipping side.
That's really fascinating, because it is an interesting and a different approach. We hear so much about the different types of scrubbers, whether it's open loop or closed loop or hybrid loop. And like you said, there's always been the question around the effluent over the side. I'm not going to get into the pros and cons of that, because I know there are a lot of camps on that, and that's not kind of where we're going there. As you start to, like you said, you had a little bit of a homegrown way to test things on the ships that you're part of there, the cement carriers, and sounds like you're able to do that. The question for you is, when you start to expand, where do you stand there, and how do you go into companies? Because really, I think really since the time that you started 4 or 5 years ago, certainly, but before 2020, at least 3+ years ago, 2018, 2017, people started to consider scrubbers. How do you get them to change their mindset that here I am proposing a different way? How do you go into companies that and how is it received? And can you talk a little bit about the challenges of changing people's mindset on this?
I mean, it's been very difficult, to be honest. A lot of people believe it's too good to be true. And they're like, well, how can this actually happen? Because it just doesn't make sense that this could be so simple, even though it's installed on thousands of power plants around the world. They don't, people just don't like taking things on board ships. The people are, is that going to stress my captain? Is it going to stress the chief engineer? Where is it going to go? Are we going to get the powder? I think the biggest problem for us is the logistics of being able to say when and where we'll get the powder. The way we got around that initially is that we've targeted ferries or RoPax ships where we know that they're in and out of port on a regular basis. They have a dedicated schedule, container feeders, and then interregional bulker carriers. But the very first successful installation we have is on a ship. She's a 96,000 deadweight bulker that trades in the Baltic and the North Sea. So we know that she's usually going to be in Scotland or Norway, and then she's going to be in either Hamburg, Amsterdam, London, something like that. So we know where she'll be at all times. To the fact she's exposed to Sika zone, so she's exposed to the MGO HSFO spread. Honestly, she's saving $20,000 a day. I don't think that ship in her life has made $20,000 a day in the market.
Don't tell the owners that. I don't want to ask you what ship that is, but that's an interesting thing. Your approach is interesting because it's a similar approach that we've seen so far in 2 other technologies, and and maybe more, but what comes right to my head, of course, are sales, hard sales that people are putting in. I'm not talking about the soft sales, but I remember seeing a YouTube video right around COVID, about 2 years ago, where it was a ship in the Baltic actually that kind of did Baltic, maybe it was an MPP ship, but one of these hybrid bulk container ships, they kind of do a little bit of everything. They saved somewhere in the order of, I think it was 5, 8, 9% with that. But again, they weren't going too far. It was a controlled route. And of course, the other parallel that I see is as we start to look at whether it's LNG bunkering or then later down the line, methanol or even hydrogen bunkering, they're probably going to start off in a similar type way. So there's certainly a parallel there.
Over the past year, you did ask one of the bigger challenges. And I think one of the things that we've had to identify and then restructure ourselves as a transition company. I'm all for we are here to save the environment. That's one of our big credos. We believe in that. This is the right thing to do. But we're talking about, and everybody's talking about, what's the next fuel going to be? Is it going to be hydrogen? Is it going to be methanol? Is it going to be ammonia? God, I hope not. So dangerous. Is LNG the right way to go? I mean, we've seen a lot of strides in LNG infrastructure. That's a hydrocarbon still. That's an issue. Even if we do have hydrogen or we get that to work, are you going to have green hydrogen? There's so many issues. And if you think there's 80,000 ships out there and they're still building them every day, well, we're going to be operating these ships for the next 10 to 20 years too. Believe that there's a big space or a space for us to help through the transition. And we can make these things happen. To bring that to attention, we're also testing, as we speak, a different powder. We have a different powder that's also used, that was from another technology it's used in diving bells in a spacecraft, to use a different chalk-based powder not to absorb, to neutralize CO2. So we would use the same concept, injecting into the exhaust gas stream. And if we're able to neutralize 10 to 15% of the CO2, we think that's golden, because there is no infrastructure for CO2 to get rid of it. I was in Singapore a couple of weeks ago, and everybody's like, oh, carbon, carbon, carbon. In Singapore, you're the biggest bunker place. You need to take it. And a guy from Singapore got up in this conference and said, well, what are we going to do with it? I mean, we don't have any old volcanoes or oil wells or anything to go pump it. If they're going to take it all, they're going to have to ship it someplace. So I think we're going to have to do this. But I'm kind of we're of an age now. We've seen quite a few technologies come and go. And I'm a firm believer at 10 years from now, we will probably be using an engine that doesn't have moving parts or something. I mean, maybe even something from like the Jetsons, something will come from that. If you think about it, like Blackberries, 10 years ago, everybody had a Blackberry until one day we didn't.
Yeah. You still talk to some. The name of this podcast is The Last Dinosaur.
Yeah.
A couple of last dinosaurs that have held on to their Blackberries. I'm not one until I think the keypad. I think the numerical values wore off the keypad. They were just doing everything by sight. But I think you're right. I think it's going to be a transitionary period, and I think that's something that there's going to be very few turnkey solutions. I think, especially you go back to the important thing, you're building ships today, and it's not even like a car. That ships have always lasted 15, 20, 15 years minimum. Usually it's 20 plus, right? And that's, now, so if you're building a ship that's going to last, say, 20 years, you're knocking on the door of the 2050 regulations. You mean to tell me you're going to have the solution for pollution right now on that ship? I don't think, like I said, I don't think that we've fully conceived it or thought it out. But let me go back to another point that we talked about, because I think you and I spoke earlier, and this is a very interesting thing. So, this is a podcast about the digital age, not about ESG or emissions reduction, although I did account, I think at least almost half of my podcast kind of touches upon it, because I think digitization and decarbonization, there is an overlap and a parallel. Where do you see, the kind of logistics challenges of getting the powder to the ships? Talk a little bit about this, because I think that this is where you and I discussed that there could be a digital overlap.
As you can imagine, the powder would have, if you have, let's just take a step back. We have two different systems. One system is completely modular, and it sits in 20-foot containers. So everything can go on a container ship, the dosing units, all the stuff. And then we call them like printer cartridges. We call them charging units. They can go on board. You can take them off and on in the normal operations of a container ship. So that means you can deliver prior to the ship arriving. And you can use the blockchain for this. And it can be completely, you'll know exactly where they are, and the owner knows exactly where they are at all times, so he doesn't stress. The other part is a tramp tanker that we never know where she's going to be, and last minute she gets diverted, to a port, wherever. So our whole thing is trying to set up enough bunkering areas to do this. Now, when you talk about the digital part of that, I think it's more of a number crunching, is figuring out where we think the best prices are. And I mean, just going back to business school, just remembering what we did about logistics, is trying to figure out, if we go to here, how much money can we make with that? How much powder do we need to have? How powder we have to store? Thank goodness, sodium bicarbonate and chalk, they don't really go off, but that would be another problem on that. We were working with IBM and Maersk on the blockchain, and they just pulled the plug 2 weeks ago, which was a complete shock to us. So now we have to think about what we do now with that. So we're going to look for another alternative. But I don't know personally if that means that the shipping market is moving away from that, or what. But that was a shock.
The articles that I read basically said maybe it was they were trying to tackle a challenge, in a nutshell, if I remember correctly. They were trying to tackle a challenge on a pretty fragmented market where people didn't want to get together with standards. And that was a lot of their hurdles, which is something that, I mean, just from my personal experience dealing, coming from my, experience with Vesson Q88, talking about standards on a noon report, and good luck, because let's just start with the speed, right? Is it speed over ground, speed made, estimated speed? I remember asking a captain about that, and he looked at me like, well, it's just speed. And I'm like, okay, I'm clearly overthinking this, yeah. So it's definitely one of those things. My personal opinion, and I don't, I think this is not a radical opinion. I think that blockchain is and this was taught to by, so I'm going to digress a second. This was taught for me when I started with Q88, because I was interested in knowing, could blockchain fit? What everybody said is it's a solution that's looking for a problem, right? So it may not necessarily blockchain. It could be something like DocuSign, right? As long as you have control of, I know where this is, and these are the people I want to give access to, that's maybe where it is. Or it could be just a simple software tracking program. But certainly, we look at blockchain to have a be all and end all, but there could be a lot of ways around it. Certainly, we're seeing blockchain has been taking off a little bit in the bills of lading world, because there is a little bit more standardization around the BL. There are starting to become trust around that. I see that being the one of the linchpins of blockchain. And let's see what happens.
Charter parties as well. I would assume that would be similar for that too, wouldn't they?
Well, charter parties are interesting because I think there's not a lot of standardization, but I do think that the blockchain for charter party could work at a minimum. But I also think for charter parties, you could just have a DocuSign type solution, right? That everything just kind of works, hand in hand, that who it is, that I passed it to you, you made these edits, I agreed to these edits, and then that's it. And it's similar to like when you do stuff, let's say with a bank where you do DocuSign, everybody does that now for mortgages or loans and stuff like that. But I think that's an interesting thing there. How are you facing that challenge? Have you found anybody yet, or any other partners that you're working with, whether it's that challenges or beyond for SodaFlexx?
No, not at this time. We've kind of just taken a deep breath, and I think we'll wait till after the first of the year to see. As you mentioned, DocuSign is something that we like. I personally love it for things like NDAs and that stuff. It's just done, and you don't have to worry about scanning and everything, which is nice. And I think that's more what we want to try for. Is that, as you said, it was a solution looking for a problem. The problem may not be as complex as they made it to be. It's just we want to know where that container is at all times. And almost, is it an Apple tag?
Well, yeah, right.
Maybe that's what it is.
Is it, you see a lot of solutions on the over the road freight, they have these kind of track your containers and stuff like that. And certainly, I guess it could get a little bit more complex when you deal with demand planning and other things. I think that's probably the next step, whether or not that's blockchain or that just becomes getting more sophisticated planning software through whatever's out there for your end. Certainly you're going to know, because you're going to have develop a similar relationship that you have with bunker, with the shipping companies. You're going to basically be in the same mindset as the bunker suppliers, right? You're just going to have to know where you're going to be, so I can get that part or the bunker or the tangential bunker part to you. And that's probably the most important thing.
Well, and we keep, as much as we try to shy away from that, we keep every agent we speak to, it's like, ooh, we'll give it to our bunker department and that kind of thing too. So it just works that way. Another thing that we see, to answer your question further about digitalization, let's talk about the Internet of Things. On a ship, over time, it's getting more and more demand for the bandwidth. We have several installations where we've had to try to even use cell phones just to get information back, because we want to have 24/7 monitoring, and we provide that to our customers. We want it for our own digitalization. We want to make sure we take all those signals in and take all that data and build up a pool of things that we can use to improve our product. We run into serious issues with people's firewalls and people's just the bandwidth on the satellite stuff. I mean, they probably installed X amount, and I'm not an expert here, but they probably installed X amount of bandwidth 5 years ago when the ship was new, and now they've totally surpassed it. It's kind of like our homes, right? And this is causing a big problem for us, because if it's new technology and something, or they're like, oh well, we don't really care about your problems. You're not our priority. We have issues, and then it stifles our development program.
So yeah, I know one of the things that we've talked about previously on this podcast is the connectivity of ships, and certainly they have improved. But as you know, it sounds like the challenge that you have is, and I think that this is what ship owners are going to have, and to an extension, charters, because as the more and more you have of these sort of products that kind of, you have these extra demands, and it's not just the installed equipment, it's this extra equipment and whatever it is, including what the seafarers want. They're probably, come to expect a higher level of
Netflix.
yeah, things like that. So I'm thinking at the end of the day, companies like yours are definitely going to be kind of almost have to be a proponent of that improvement.
We've actually spoken. It's like, well, should we put our own satellite service on board? Because if we want, and this is what comes back to the data. It's worth the data. I do know of so a basic part of a exhaust gas cleaning system is a monitor at the top of the stack, and that's what tells you, are you in compliance or not.
Right.
And that has to be logged, and it has to be saved, and it has to be retrievable. And so there is not upstart, but a newish exhaust gas monitor that's proposing a different way of doing things. Instead of purchasing the monitor, they'll give it to you for free, but sell you the data. And that's a whole nother pricing model that personally I think is going to have a hard time, because owners are like, well, I'd rather just pay for it and be done with it and not have to worry about another contract.
Right.
And when you're talking about something that doesn't cost a lot of money in the scheme of things, then it's just more hassle. But those are people trying to do things. But if I was to do that, then we would have to guarantee that we had the right amount of bandwidth to get all that information, so we can actually sell it.
Yeah, and then you get into the whole issue of connectivity, and then of course Absolutely. you could even get into the issue of if they're, because you talked earlier about Seika and everything else, what happens if a ship do they are they trading in certain places maybe that they don't want you to know about, or anything else? You can get into a lot of those sort of questions as well. So certainly it's pretty interesting, and it's pretty ripe for how it deals with the connectivity with the Internet of Things, certainly from a ship point of view, for sure. As we start to wrap up, I always like to ask this question: what advice, like you said, you've been in the industry for a long time, what advice would you give somebody who's looking to get into this industry, about it and about kind of your venture?
Do you mean in the shipping industry, or
in the shipping industry, in any parts of it, given
well,
that?
I'm kind of if you ask me about new tech or stuff like this, I mean, it's twice as much as you think, and twice as long as you think.
Well, no, I just think just in the shipping industry in general, like what is your
come in the shipping industry in general? I personally struggle with this offsite working. I mean, and let's don't be the last dinosaur here, say, oh, you got to go to be in the office 12 hours a day. But I cannot understand and believe that you're going to give a guy a laptop and he's 20 years old and you say, go be a shipbroker, and you're going to sit at home in his underwear and try to figure that out. It's impossible. As you well know, the language, the customs, the way things work, it has to be it has to be imbued into you through just osmosis almost. It's like listening to it around you all the time. And people sitting in offices as opposed to trading floors. I think that's the wrong way. So if I was a young guy, and I don't know if I will encourage my children to be in shipping, to be honest with you, because especially broking, I think that's going to go eventually. I know we've been around a long time with that, but eventually that's going to go the way of the computer. But you got to be with the people, and you got to learn and learn how people work. And I think that shipping is one of those ones that you can't do from home. So if you can find a shop that will allow you to do that, then that's the way I would do it.
It's funny. I think, sir, I agree with you on the trading houses and stuff like that. You definitely need to be there and sitting in. I think as you get a little more experience, you could probably get away with fewer days, but I do think there is a culture thing. I think that's a culture thing for any place that you start. I think it's very difficult to get the culture of any company, regardless of industry, get their culture down by sitting at a desk. It's certainly something that even sitting here and going through the transition of being a Q88 person to we were purchased by Vesson earlier this year. They have different culture. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just kind of getting some of the nuances certainly would be beneficial sitting in the office. Certainly there are ways of counteracting that by meeting people. And we've done a lot of that. And that's actually worked out pretty well. But I think for somebody coming out of school, like you said, okay, figure it out. That's really difficult to do if you're not sitting in an office. Certainly, I do think that's certainly more so with trading, because you have to hear what's going on. You have to hear, oh, that operator just got off a call and that did not sound good, and he's operating one of my ships. So
I better think about this.
Let me go take a walk over and see what's going on. Is something late? And oh no, it was my wife telling me that the dog, I have to take the dog to the vet or something. Oh, okay.
Yeah, but you worked on trading floors. They're an organism, right? And you can tell by the noise what's going on. You can get a feel for what's happening where you can't over a Zoom call.
No, you definitely
doesn't work.
Yeah, you definitely can't. You definitely can't for sure. I mean, there's definitely limitations. But that's kind of my opinion. I do have a divergent opinion. I do think that my opinion is that brokers are going to be around a little longer. And I think there's two reasons why. One, I think as companies continue to downsize.
Fair enough. Yeah.
I think that I think that, especially on operations, other things, there's an institutional knowledge that goes away. So, what happens is company, ExxonMobil downsized, I think 2 years ago for the first time in their history. And I'm not saying they lost people in the Marine Department. I don't know. But across the board, as you have companies that do that and take that decision, they're going to rely more on third party outsource, whether it's, full blown, we're going to outsource the entire X department, whatever that is, to third party, or we're just going to rely on brokers and contractors to do these specific tasks. I think there's going to be more of that because it kind of ebbs and flows, and you're less overhead. It kind of looks better on a balance sheet on things like that. Number one. Number two is I do think, that as that part of that is there's always a level, and this is an A and a B part, that there's always a level that, especially certain companies want that you have somebody in the middle who's validating what you're doing. So auditors come in and there's no funny business, because we've seen that happen. So it's a little harder to do when you have a supposedly neutral, somebody who is neutral. And if they remain neutral and they know this is what we did, and this is why we did it. And I think the other part of that is, kind of a personal thing, is that when things go wrong, it's very unlike that an owner will yell at a charter and vice versa. But if there's a person in the middle to kind of help smooth that, you
always need somebody to yell at. That's always a good thing.
You do, and I say that kind of tongue in cheek, but sometimes you have to say, well, hold on a second, let's take a deep breath. All right, all right, I'll get this sorted. And there again, where somebody who's maybe a little new and green can get upset about something, the broker can say, hold on, let's get this resolved very quickly, and you get it done. And next thing you know, you're just moving on to the next thing. So I do have to disagree. I think that the broker's job will look different as we get over time. I think the demands are going to be different. But I do think there's going to be importance on what makes a good broker. Yeah, it's a relationship and getting the job done. But I think if you look at a brokerage shop, there's going to be different things what's important. In other words, there may be some things that in the past or that wasn't really on the radar. It has come on.
Interesting enough, Chris, what you're saying though is that the relationship between the broker and the client will be even more paramount. And I don't see how you do that if you're going to be sitting at your home office.
Exactly.
That's going to be, yeah.
Exactly. No, and that's what I'm saying. But there are other jobs. I mean, like my job as a product manager, I don't really need to be in the office with everybody else. It's nice when we do, but right now I really don't. A salesperson for a software company like mine, nice to be in the office and know what's going on, but I don't necessarily need to be there all the time. I need to be out with clients. So it's a different type of thing. But then again, sales do have to be out with clients. So anyway, well, thank you very much, Barry. This was very interesting. It's a really neat technology, what you're working on. I wish you best of luck, and we're going to continue to watch your success as you move forward. Thank you for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you. It's what's almost 5:00 here in London. It's time for the pub, and stay warm and have happy holidays. Okay.
Thank you. You too, Barry.
Cheers,
thank
Chris.
you.
Thanks a lot. Ciao.